Before we start, I just want to let you, the viewer or listener, know that we had some technical difficulties with this recording. Some of the usual audio and video files that are normally recorded when we do our podcast were either low quality due to internet issues or were corrupted. So apologies in advance that this episode is not up to our usual production standards.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Leadership Podcast. For those of you who are new listeners, or a reminder for our returning listeners, this is a podcast where we hope that our disagreements inform your decisions. And so the four of us, are coming from four different political ideologies, but we hope to have conversations about the current events or the main political topics of our time and try to get some kind of consensus that, to understand where each person is coming from. Our goal is not necessarily to convince each other of someone else, to change the way that they think or what they believe. And I think that's pertinent to our conversation tonight or today, whatever time of day you're listening, because we are going to be talking about abortion. So before we start this episode, we've not done this before, but I think it's important to give people a trigger warning that we are going to be talking about abortion, which may bring in discussions of sexual assault, domestic violence, incest, and then also reproductive loss. So if any of those are issues that are sensitive to you, just listener discretion is advised. So that being said, I don't normally like to go first, but I think this week maybe it's a good topic for me to go first with. I think especially to set the stage of where I'm coming from and the evolution of my belief when it comes to this topic. I would say before I had a child, I didn't really understand abortion. I didn't really understand all that it encompasses. And I didn't understand why people said abortion is healthcare. And so it was only after I had a child and after I had a miscarriage that I understood all of the nuances that came along with abortion. So I think that informs where I'm coming from with everything I'm going to say tonight, right? So I believe that abortion is not something that should be, whether a person can decide to have an abortion or not and pursue that as an option. I don't believe that the government should be involved in that decision. Ultimately, I was okay under the Roe v. Wade framework. So I guess I'll say that under Roe v. Wade, it basically the way that decision was laid out was it said that the government had a compelling interest in the life of an unborn child at a certain point, right? So it kind of divided up pregnancy and saying when a pregnancy was not viable, that the government had a lesser compelling interest to intervene and dictate what could happen with that pregnancy. But then when it hit a certain point in the pregnancy, then the government's interest became more compelling, such that it could regulate it. But that being said, there was always the ability to, look at the factual situation. So when you're talking about late-term abortions, and it's a question of the life of the mother and the life of the child, there was always room for that decision to be a medical decision or a decision made with the parties. The law didn't forbid that. It just changed that there had to be some type of compelling circumstance in order to perform an abortion in the third trimester, essentially, right? I didn't love every aspect of that framework, but I did feel that it provided a balance for people when you're talking about when life begins, right? Because realistically, like I have a first cousin who was born at 27 weeks and she's in college, right? So there's an acknowledgement that, a pregnancy pre the 40-week, term, you can have a viable pregnancy long before that. So I understand that nuance, but I think that a lot of that gets lost in our discussions where there's this absolute desire to have a one size fits all. I'm going to pass the off to you guys, but the thing that I just want to emphasize with it is like, I don't think with where we are now that Roe v. Wade has been repealed or overturned or however you want to look at it, in the wake of Dobbs, I don't think that the current state has allowed to protect the life of women. And I find that fundamentally problematic given some of the things that, like I said, I personally experienced, which I will probably talk about on this podcast. But at the end of the day, the idea that the law now prevents a woman from choosing her own life, and or being given the medical care she needs to preserve her own life, um, I just find that unacceptable in our country. And so that's where I stand with. Okay, pitching it off to you guys. Like, who wants to go next?
All right. I think, Thea, that this is another one of those topics where we really have to make sure that we all understand the words that we're using to make sure that
Mhm.
we at least have a consensus on the definitions of the things that we're talking about so that we don't end up talking past each other. So like you mentioned a few things that hopefully our listeners are somewhat aware of, but maybe not. So I think one of them is Roe v. Wade. I think hopefully everybody knows what Roe v. Wade was, but correct me if I'm wrong, but that Supreme Court decision essentially under the 14th Amendment and under the right to privacy basically said that a woman could get an abortion and that it was it was characterized as a national right. From what I read about Roe v. Wade, it seems like the legal basis for Roe v. Wade was without any sort of national legislation, a bit tenuous. And from my understanding, that's why Dobbs was able to overturn it. And of course, Dobbs was the recent Supreme Court case that did overturn Roe v. Wade. So, Thea, do I have those basic facts correct, more or less?
Yeah, I mean, it was under Roe v. Wade, and then Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was the 1990 case that upheld Roe v. Wade. It established a legal framework pretty much under the right of privacy, because in order to enforce, or to criminalize abortion, you have to invade the privacy of the person who's having the abortion. So that's like a loose way of explaining it, but it did not establish like it did not necessarily hold under equal protection that everybody had the right to this to have an abortion, but it did establish this framework, and that's where the viability issue came in, where they tried to say at what point does the government have an interest to get involved and breach basically the privacy that we're all entitled to. That was what the framework of those two cases really looked at.
Okay.
Yeah, and my understanding was that the right to privacy was generally through the Ninth Amendment, the unenumerated rights that just because written in the Constitution doesn't mean that you don't still have some of these other rights that aren't written down. A little bit of 9 and a combination, what was it, 4, search and seizure.
I looked up some definitions in my research for this, just again to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So Merriam-Webster dictionary is something that I think a lot of people kind of trust to have definitions for the English language. So they define abortion as the termination of pregnancy after, accompanied by, resulting in, or closely followed by the death of the embryo or fetus. And you mentioned, Thea, when does life start? And I think this is a point where I personally feel we're not talking about life, we're talking about personhood. Because by the scientific definition of life, which is, an organismic state characterized by capacity for metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction, according to Merriam-Webster. I think even the fertilized egg meets the simple definition of life. It is alive in that it does all those things. I think scientifically, we're not really talking about if it's alive or not. What we're really talking about is it a person, right? So do we have any disagreements so far on that stuff before we move forward?
No, but I also, one thing you mentioned, just the definition of abortion. I think one thing that's relevant to this conversation is that there is no medical difference between a miscarriage and an abortion. A miscarriage is an abortion. So I think that's something that gets lost in this. That the termination of a pregnancy can happen naturally, as well as through medical intervention. And there's no way to determine what the cause of an abortion after the fact. So for women who have partial miscarriages, there's no way to determine whether medically, whether that is a natural miscarriage or if there was some type of, failed medical intervention that caused that miscarriage. And that's relevant to, the post-Dobbs world. So.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Now, I had mentioned before we started this podcast, when we, in one of our discussions, I had mentioned, no, it was during our last podcast. I happened to say, like, I think one of the gray areas that we have to wrestle with as a country is that we don't really have a definition for personhood. But lo and behold, when I was doing my research for this podcast, I came across one U.S. code, which says, it's 1 U.S. Code 8. And it says, in determining the meaning of any act of Congress or of any ruling, regulation, or interpretation of the various administrative bureaus and agencies of the United States, the words person, human being, child, and individual shall include every infant member of the species Homo sapiens who is born alive at any stage of development. And so I learned something in my research in that we do have a national definition of personhood, and it is that you must be born or delivered by cesarean. So, it goes further on to basically say any of the methods that we understand today as being born constitute that act, and that you are a person subsequent to being born.
I think, though, although I agree, we have a legal definition. I don't think we have a consensus. And I think
I agree with that.
That's where the issue is, that there are many people who would disagree with that definition. And that's where you get the controversy as far as, abortion is concerned.
Absolutely. I think, Brett, we should hear from our Republican. Do you have other thoughts right now about when personhood starts?
Well, I mean, that's kind of the big thing, right? We talked about that a little bit last time too. That's where the big debate comes in, is defining when we can characterize someone as a person, right? Because, Thea, you mentioned a lot that we want to determine what kind of society that we want to be, right? And when we have something that's in our Constitution that the first right that we have is life, that's where we have to look to see where that starts, right? And that's kind of the big definition. I want to start off by saying, you guys know me, I deeply care about people, right? That includes mothers, it's children, families, but it's also about understanding truth. And like, this conversation isn't just about politics or ideology. It's about human lives, right? And it's about the kind of culture that we're creating and that we're willing to stand for as a nation, right? I believe that both the mother and the child are valuable. Like, it's not one or the other, it's both. Right. I believe that our national culture, we have to shift back to the value that we have a value for life at every stage. Right. That doesn't mean that we're ignoring hardships or pretending that pregnancy is easy. Right. As my wife, we've got 4 kids. We've had a few miscarriages. I mean, we understand like there's some hardship that goes along with that. But it does acknowledge that there is a sacredness to human life, especially when it's most vulnerable. Right. And in today's world, we often talk about rights and choices, but we talk very little about responsibility that comes along with that. And, this isn't an all-encompassing statement, but it's an understanding that a lot of the times when we come to talk about this issue and we talk about reproductive rights and things like that, we're not talking about the sacredness of life. We're talking oftentimes about the ability for people to have sex without consequences. Right. Now, I'm not talking about medical interventions and things like that, because I do honestly believe that if the mother's life is in danger, that you should do everything you can to save both. But if the medical care that saves the woman's life results in the loss of the child, it's tragic, but I think that is acceptable because you're saving the mother. But it's just, again, it kind of comes down to that responsibility piece that, like, I'm sorry, like, sex is not a basic need. You don't need it to survive. It's a powerful act that brings life into this world. And with that power, there comes responsibility from the life that might result from it. Right. And that's not like to shame anybody. I'm just saying that I think we should challenge our society to live at a higher standard for how we value life. And, for me, I believe in both grace and truth when it comes to that stuff. It's grace for those that are hurting and afraid, but it's also truth about what abortion really is. And when I say that, I'm talking about elective abortion, right? When someone chooses to abort a child, because to your point, there are things that happen and there are partial miscarriages and there are tragic circumstances that come around to this stuff. But when someone chooses just to say, like, I don't want this pregnancy anymore, that's the ending of an innocent life, right? And my goal in saying that, I'm not trying to condemn anybody, but it's more to call us back to compassion, back to a conscience, and ultimately getting us back to a culture that actually protects life and honors the dignity of both the mother and the child.
So, Brett, let me ask, you mentioned if the life of the mother is in danger, but what about if, for instance, there is something discovered with the fetus? We tend to do these sonograms and these other checks on the fetal health throughout pregnancy, and let's say at 20 weeks or 30 weeks, they discover something that is, terminal for the child. Do you believe that an abortion is appropriate then?
No, I don't. Right. Because, we don't have to look at it just from the standpoint of, we don't determine the quality of someone's life based on their circumstances. Right.
Okay. So what if it's a situation where the fetus would die as soon as the umbilical cord was cut? Or the child
I still
would die?
don't agree with it. I mean, at least from my standpoint, it's still a life, right? Okay. Everything should be done to try to create that. And yes, I understand, like, it's still a tragic thing, but a child's worth is not determined by the circumstances of their conception or by the circumstances of their struggles.
So I will push back a little bit. You said a child's worth isn't determined by the circumstances of their conception, but you also previously talked about responsibility with sex. So I know Dion is normally our statistics person, but approximately 1 in 5 women in this country are raped in their life. And we know that we don't have a society that's free of sexual assault. We don't have a society that's free of incest. We don't have a society that's free of domestic violence within relationships. And so often sex is not the result of consensual parts on the part or consensual act on the part of the woman. And then to find yourself pregnant, then it's not a situation where you are, having to be responsible for your own acts. It's a point where then you're having to be responsible for the violence of another and then putting your life in jeopardy as a result of then having to carry pregnancy to term. And that's where the problem that I have is, like, when we've talked about this before, the one size fits all nature of banning abortions, because, it's not like we have a great system for identifying and encouraging people who are victims of sexual assault to come forward. So when we talk about, like, rape exceptions to abortion bans, in reality, they're very difficult to actually for someone to utilize those exceptions. And I can tell you, as a lawyer that's represented victims of domestic violence, it's almost impossible to be able to get into court in time and meet the standard for showing, rape and incest. So that's a huge problem that I have. And then the other piece of it is, like, the mortality rate for women in this country. When it comes to childbirth, I almost died giving birth to my son. So for full disclosure, I almost died. I had an emergency C-section. I think that the day that my son was born was by far the worst, most painful day of my life. And my son was wanted, and I'm happy that I have a child and I have my son, but it was a horrifying experience when I gave birth to my son. And I would hate for someone to have to go through that. And it wasn't their choice. It wasn't their choice. And that's the thing.
Sure.
And I'm lucky to be alive. So my life could have been lost in that. I always say, but for the grace of God, I'm still here. And that was in a hospital with, medical treatment, all I had insurance, all these things. And I still was almost a statistic having my son. So it's
I fully understand that, because having seen my wife go through similar, I understand that point, right? Obviously, I haven't been through that experience myself, but having been close to it, I understand it. And, life is not without risk, right? That's just kind of some of the inherent part that goes along with it. And when you're talking about a woman who becomes pregnant by rape, I mean, that is a horrific injustice. And that is something that deserves overwhelming support and love. But it's one of those that adding another tragedy on top of that, the elective death of a baby, it doesn't usually heal the first trauma, right? And it's kind of one of those that two wrongs don't make a right. I agree that the rapist should be punished to the fullest extent of the law, but an innocent child conceived shouldn't pay for that with his or her life. They shouldn't have to pay for the father's crime.
I don't think that it's seen as, not having the child or not going forward with the pregnancy is meant to heal the wrong of the rape, but it is meant to prevent further suffering on the part of the woman. And there's so many different factors that go into this. My argument still comes back to, this is not a decision that should be made by the state. It's not a decision that should be made for people by the government, because there's so many factors that go into it, and we don't have the means to adjudicate each and every one and to figure out when and if it makes sense for one person to pursue an abortion and somebody else. I just don't think that's our place as a society. And to what you're saying, like I said, I started off by saying could swallow the framework under Casey or under Roe, where there was a point in the pregnancy where you're arguing this pregnancy can exist without the woman. We've made it this far, and now we really are talking about someone who's close enough to the legal definition of personhood. But if you're talking 6 weeks into a pregnancy, that's where I don't. So I guess full disclosure, I don't consider that a person, or I don't. That is a small, tiny embryo that the woman is carrying. So I think that's
understandable. I guess my question would be, what species is the embryo?
I'm saying it's not. I don't think that the loss at that point, like it goes back to where we're talking about for artificial insemination. Now what do you do with embryos that are never put into they're never inseminated, I guess, into a person's body? And those are people too. When you take it to its natural conclusion, at some point, you're weighing the rights of the potential for life against an existing life. And that's where I have a problem.
Well, but I think there's an issue there too, Thea, to where it's like a lot of the times the argument comes from the standpoint where pregnancy is a burden, where pregnancy is a bad thing to have happen. I mean, the circumstances around it might be terrible. I understand that. But when we start looking at the potential for life that comes from that and what that person has the ability to become through that life, you're completely negating that fact when you elect to terminate that.
But it's a weighing of interest, right? Because you have the potential for the life of the fetus, and you have the potential for the death of the mother, and both of those are real, are real outcomes, right? Women die in childbirth every day in the country, so it's not an insignificant risk. Abortion is far more safe for women than actually going through a pregnancy. And then also to say that a pregnancy is not a burden. Again, I very much wanted to be a mom, and there were a lot of things that were very difficult in pregnancy,
Well, I think there's a definition of burden that kind of goes there, Thea, to where people often think of a burden as a negative, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'll tell you, my children, they're very much a burden on my life. But they are a wonderful blessing of a burden, right? But a burden just simply means it's a weight that I must carry. And there's a responsibility that comes with that. What I mean is that pregnancy is viewed as like a negative burden on a woman's life, where it's like, okay, you have to give up your whole life now to just simply care for this child. And I don't think that's true. Our society has gone to a way where.
But it's fact specific for the woman, right? Like for me, I was a full adult. My children were the result of consensual choices that I made, but the story that came out, a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, about the 10-year-old who had been raped and had to be taken out of state to be given an abortion. That is a burden on a 10-year-old to make a 10-year-old carry a pregnancy term. So my issue is it's always going to be fact specific, and having the law not allow for that, and having the government make those decisions without knowing the facts of those cases. Then when you do have the situation where it is a negative burden, there's no relief for those people. And that to me is a tragedy.
Let me see if I can kind of summarize the two viewpoints that I'm hearing. Brett, it sounds to me like you would like to see at the national level that we declare that personhood starts in utero, and then that person would be protected by the law. And Thea, if I understand you correctly, you're saying you would rather return back to what we had under Roe v. Wade, where nationally it was considered that, I think they said basically up at the third trimester, the fetus is essentially considered viable. So no abortions during the third trimester, but potentially up to the start of the third trimester. I think under Roe v. Wade, it was allowed. So, I mean, the details might not be exactly right, but is that essentially your position, Thea? That
correct?
Okay. And Brett, did I characterize yours?
I mean, to some degree. It's one of those that less government is better, in my opinion, right? And this comes back to the same discussion we've had several times throughout multiple of our podcasts. It's a matter of the moral standing. What is the heart posture of the people? And I think that's where we really are missing it, is that there is not a sanctity of life, in all capacities. And that's where it kind of extends to. And when we step away from that, that's where we start running into issues, because when you can start making reasons and excuses as to why someone lesser than you or they're weaker than you, and so therefore they're not deserving of life because they can't stand up and fight for it themselves. Well, I think that actually falls upon the strong to be able to stand up for those things. But when we do that, you start really digressing into a lot of the arguments for eugenics and things like that, to where it's like, oh, well, they're a lesser being, all right, so therefore they don't have the same level of rights. I just think that's a very slippery slope to get on.
I guess the problem that I have is that in order to adopt that theory, it ignores the life and the autonomy of the person carrying the fetus, and all of the things burdens that are placed on her through, and it's like to acknowledge that, well, yes, a woman can die in childbirth. Yes, these, end badly for her. To me, is you're just then saying you're doing the opposite. You're placing the life of the fetus above the life of the woman. And I don't think that the government should be in a position to choose, and in the post-Dobbs world, I'm horrified by all these different cases that have come to light. The two women in Georgia who died because medical care was withheld because of the abortion ban. Again, the fact that there's no way to tell when somebody shows up to an ER whether they are having a incomplete miscarriage or if they're a botched abortion, and the fact that you have hospitals turning women away and not giving them the care that they need, they're not following the best practices out of fear of prosecution at the hands of the government if they were to treat people in the way that medical guidance would advise. That's wrong. That's where I have a problem. That's just wrong. And that when we talk about who we want to be as a country, I don't want to be in a country, or I don't want to live in a country where if I show up to an ER and I say I need help and I need care, if there's an established practice that can provide me care, it will be withheld because my doctor's afraid that if they don't know exactly every little fact, that they could be persecuted or prosecuted for providing me that care. That's not a country I want to live in.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that, Thea, because I mean, at least in my mind, treatment to save the mother's life, it's not the same as elective abortion. And when you're writing good law, there should always be provisions for doing what you can to save the woman's life. Like that should always be the case. But it shouldn't be just like, oh, well, the choice to save the mother is simply to kill the child. It should be emphatic that they're trying to save both. But if in the event that the life-saving care you give to the mother results in the death of the child, again, that's still a tragic thing, but that falls into that realm of,
But
I
the
don't know,
problem that we're finding
acceptable,
is
I
now,
guess.
but the problem we're finding now is like, do you want to wait till a woman's about to die to say, let me give, like, when do you make that choice that we've gotten far enough where it looks like she might actually die, let's intervene, where we could have intervened 24 hours ago. And what happened in the two cases in Georgia was they waited too long to engage in the medical intervention. And by the time they acted, these women were too far gone. And that's, to me, the current system in a post-Dobbs world, it allows for that with the way some of these abortion bans are drafted. And it
I
takes
mean,
the
to me, that just
decision
seems
out
like
of,
bad judgment, though. I mean, that seems like a
but,
case to where you have a doctor that made a bad choice, and now you're trying to write law around one instance for that.
but not
It
really,
just doesn't
because,
seem like that's the right way to go.
well, because of the way that and then we see this in Texas, and so there's a number of lawsuits that we're seeing right now that is challenging this idea of how you define, when do you draw the line that the life of the mother is in danger, because that's ambiguous in the way that these bans are written, and it doesn't allow a lot of leeway for medical discretion, on the part of the doctor. Then it really ties the doctor's hands, and now you have doctors being motivated out of fear of their own prosecution versus what they think is best for a patient. And
So
that's the where we are right now.
I think it may be an important thing to sort of nail down here for the purpose of this discussion is maybe we should make an assumption that we could write the laws and regulations properly so that whatever the actual outcome that we desire, let's assume that we could write the law correctly, and because otherwise, we would get into a whole discussion about how all kinds of laws in our country are just written poorly, and all kinds of bad things happen. Because we're talking about the issue of abortion, I think we should probably talk about what is our desired end state, and just to make sure that this conversation keeps going, we'll just assume that the laws would be written appropriately
I
for that.
actually,
The
I
problem,
think
the problem with that, though,
yeah, I'll let
Dion, is
you
that it's on purpose. Like the vagueness, in my opinion, the laws are written as vague as they are on purpose because they don't want things to, like, they want the medical professionals to be questioning themselves such that they don't do XYZ. They want not know if they're going to be prosecuted, and therefore they don't try to get an abortion. Like it's on purpose is the way that I see it.
I
Yeah,
mean,
and
yeah,
I
the
and I
laws
take your
are,
point, but I don't like if we go down that path in this discussion. I think that'll take up the whole rest of the discussion, and I'm not
but that
sure that.
But Dion, that's the discussion, right? The discussion isn't, I don't want this to be an academic, hypothetical discussion of what could be. I would rather us have a discussion of what is and what the current state of abortion is in our country. And to Will's point, the laws are purposely written to be restrictive. They're purposely written, the abortion bans that have come in place or that were triggered when Roe v. Wade was overturned, they're purposely written to not allow medical professionals to have discretion in making these recommendations or in having these medical interventions. And that is the problem to me, right? Is that these laws are not written in a way that takes what Brett has been saying into consideration and also takes what I'm saying into consideration. They're written
Yeah.
to be restrictive and in a way that to me, when we talk about lesser citizenship, it's telling me as a full grown childbearing age woman, my life has less value than the child that I may be bearing, right? Because the law doesn't allow for my doctor to give me medical advice or engage in medical treatment that prefers my life over a child's until I'm near death. And that's, to me, even if it's foreseeable that that the gap between near death, it's coming, but we're not quite sure that we're there yet. My doctor doesn't have the discretion to say, you know what, Thea, based on what's going on, based on what I'm seeing, this is what, we would say would be the best practice for medical treatment. It would be to perform an abortion. Doctors don't have that liberty anymore.
That is a fair point. And you're right. It does color the current situation that we are in this country, that people have written laws in that way. Recently, I started to think about abortion in terms of maybe an analogous situation. Do you guys remember Terry Schiavo?
Yeah.
She was in a coma. She was on life support, and her husband wanted to take her off life support, and her parents did not want that to happen. And the government got involved, and it was really messy. And I think that the government being involved in that was not helpful to anybody, right? She was eventually taken off of life support. And, I kind of think of those end of life things where you have somebody who is a person who cannot speak for themselves, who, it's between that person's next of kin or loved ones or whomever and the doctors to say, is this do we continue with this medical procedure? Do we continue with this person being on life support, or do we end this person's life because it's in the best interests of that person or of everybody involved, right? And it's not an easy decision, but it's generally not a decision that the government gets involved in. I wonder if that is a better framework for us to think about abortion.
Well, I think you can take it a step further and say that machine that was keeping Terry Schiavo alive, now imagine that machine is a human being. That life support system is a human being. And so now you're adding another layer. And I think then that's where you get to the how it's so difficult, and I think the thing that I think about is just the way that this issue is framed on the right is so difficult for me a lot of times, especially the way I remember the debate where Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were discussing this topic, and where he was trying to frame it as Democrats want abortion in the 9th month. And Hillary Clinton chimed in and said, the moment, the person who's carried a pregnancy to the 9th month and that's choosing an abortion, those are the most tragic circumstances that people could probably imagine. And it is not that, oops, my bad, my birth control failed, so now 9 months into this pregnancy, I want an abortion. That's not the reality of this. And so I think part of what I would like us to discuss is how much we demonize the other side, right? When we have these conversations. And I'll say the same, the left isn't always innocent of demonizing, I think there are people who have genuine beliefs. I don't question, Brett, I don't question your belief in that when life begins, when personhood begins. I don't question that that's a genuine belief that you have, nor do I think it's my place to judge you for it. But I do think we're bad about that on both sides.
And to that point, so in Florida, we have a 6-week abortion ban, right? And many, if not most, women don't even know that they're pregnant that quickly, right? If in my mind, that is not a good faith effort. That is, if you think that life begins at conception, then say that or do that. Don't say, well, okay, we're going to give you up to. That's not a real option in my view. It's not the writing that law did not think to themselves, I think life begins at 6 weeks. They wrote a law to make it seem like they were giving women, this was a compromise, when really they just don't want abortions to be happening.
Basically, they allowed Plan B. That's kind of all they allowed to happen.
I don't know if you guys felt this. I didn't know until I got pregnant that they start the count as your last missed period, right? So if your cycle is, 4 to 6 weeks, by the time you've missed your period, you're already 6 weeks pregnant, and I didn't realize that until I got pregnant. And I was like, oh, it starts it's not as of your missed period, that's day one. I mean, as of you noticing you've missed your period, it's the last day of your last cycle, or the first day of your cycle. And so that's another reason why the 6 week ban is not it, like you said, it allows for the person who had sex and said, oh crap, and maybe took plan B, or the person who's constantly checking, tracking their cycle. But most people aren't going to know they're pregnant at 6 weeks.
And
So I'm
Well,
going
I
to
think
bring
kind of the
in.
point with that, though, when you're looking at like the 6 week time frame, that
Mhm.
accounts for someone who was raped, right? To where they know that happened and that there's a potential that's for it, and so they can go and do something about it. Now, again, I didn't write the law. I'm not in a state that has that specific law, but knowing that around it, where it's kind of one of those like, again, children come from having sex, right? It's one of those,
Mhm.
it is a risk of having sex, whether you are on birth control or not. Yes, there is the options for having contraceptives to where you can do that, but that is a risk of having sex. So if you are in a relationship where you are choosing to have sex, there is a risk that goes along with that. And yes, I understand you may not know till the 6 weeks, but it's kind of one of those like, play certain games, get certain prizes. It's just kind of the risk that goes along with it. I mean, the 6 week, when you look at that, that's for the ones that you have an instance where, okay, someone had sex that they didn't want to. There's the potential that they're pregnant. Well, now it gives a window to be able to do something about that. I still have issues with that because, again, life is life. If I gave you 2 ultrasounds and I showed you, okay, one of these children was conceived in rape and one of these children was conceived in a loving, desirable family, could you tell me the difference? And you can't. Right. So there's still a value of life that comes along with that. I think the way we need to change the framing of it is how we promote it to society and how we talk about it. And when these tragic things happen, there should be more support and more play in that area rather than just saying, oh, well, your option, even though you're afraid and scared, your option is just to end a life. And I think
Well,
that's where it's a problem.
there's a young lady who spoke at the Democratic convention last year, and she was a victim of incest. And I found her story to be very compelling because she said, she found herself, I think she was like 12 or something like that, and she found herself pregnant. And by the time it was past 6 weeks when she finally did get to tell somebody what happened to her. And she went to the doctor, and they said to her, basically, the magic words is that you have options. And for her, hearing that there were options, that she could decide for herself what to do next after her options had been taken from her, that was like the first step to her, I guess, where you said when you're at healing. But it was also like knowing that I'm not going to continually be victimized and not have the ability to make choices for myself and my body. The trauma of sexual assault and rape, normally the way it plays out, and I mean, again, it's fact specific, to assume that everybody, the minute they're raped, are like, oh my God, let me go figure out, can I get an abortion? Like, that doesn't account for the way that trauma affects people, and especially sexual trauma, right? There's a whole, without getting into that, I guess the other thing is I was a SARC when I was in the Air Force, so that's like a whole nother area of expertise. But most people who are traumatized, they're not thinking, they've experienced trauma. So they're not necessarily thinking through, what do I need to do in a very short period of time? Unfortunately, sometimes it can take weeks for them to come to a conclusion. And under that 6 week ban, they may not have that time. And
Well,
so,
and
again,
that's why I'm saying,
yeah,
Thea, that the support from the community needs to be more emphasized. There needs to be more in play for that instead
yeah,
of just, again, demonizing this fact of like, oh my gosh, you're pregnant, your life is over, you have no options, like you're just
yeah.
going to suffer for the rest of your life now because you've had a child. Like, that's a terrible mindset to approach this with. And again, it all comes back to that sanctity of life and determining what kind of people do we want to be. I understand tragedies happen, and I'm not discounting that, and I'm not. I have compassion for those people that go through those things because trauma it's a terrible thing, and unless someone has experienced that specific trauma, you can't understand it. Right? There's no empathy that extends to that. Yes, I understand you can sympathize with people, but it's not the same. But having systems in place that we actually care for people and that we actually uplift motherhood and the value of life of children, I don't, to me, that's where the argument always comes down to, is instead of just saying like, well, there aren't any options except, let's terminate a life.
Well, I don't think two things. I agree with you wholeheartedly that as a society, we don't have a safety net to catch people when they do experience these traumas, right? Like the system is not designed to identify when someone's been sexually assaulted and create a cocoon around that person to help them move forward. We don't have a society that does that. Maybe people may have a supportive family, maybe they may have a community that they can lean on, but quite often that's not the case. But the second point is, I still say telling someone they have options is just that, is giving them the ability to say, you know what, maybe this isn't how I wanted to be a mom, but this is how I'll become a mom. But also giving them the ability to say, I don't want this. I don't want to put my body through this. I don't want to face the potential negative medical outcomes that can come of this. I don't want to have a child. Therefore, the government should not be involved in the decision of whether I have to. And that's where, and I get it's a fundamental difference, but I don't think it's the role of government to say to that girl who decides that the option she chooses is to not have the child, that the government says, no, sorry that's happened to you, but no, you need to have this child. You need to be the vessel in which to, carry this child. And if negative medical outcome that happens to you, sorry, the life of the child outweighs your own interests. And that's where I have a problem.
So Dion, earlier you had said, talking about what's the end state that we want, right? I think one of the issues that comes up here, and Brett, I'll bring up the meme that Republicans are pro-birth, not pro-life. That it would be easier to understand or to agree with the traditional Republican conservative position on life if after these children were born, there were support systems in place and assistance for the 10-year-old that was just forced to give birth, or whatever the case may be. That if the government is going to step in and say, thou shalt have this baby, that when the baby's born, the government is still there to say, and we're going to help you to raise this child healthy and happy and live a prosperous life. When, Brett, when you're saying like, you never know, you were saying, something like you never know who this kid might be, the potential for a great life. But then when we see at the same time, again, the traditional conservative Republican position of, they don't like Head Start, they don't like WIC, they don't like, all of these programs that are designed to assist women and children. It makes it seem like rooms are pro-birth and not pro-life.
Yeah, and I understand where that argument is coming from. And there are some historical approaches that Republicans have taken around that I disagree with. Right now, you guys have also heard me talk about this before, to where I don't think that is the government's role to provide all of those support structures. I think that's the community's responsibility to provide those, because you're going to see a major extension that comes from that too. When you have a society that values life, you're going to see that reflected in the way things play out in that society. Right. So if you have a community that's really tied into that and something tragic happens, you will see a support system come into play and they will value that. But I also think if you have a community that values life on that level and it's talked about and promoted at high levels, I don't think you're going to have a lot of the tragic incidents that happen. I'm not saying that they won't happen, right? There's always possibilities for things. Again, I mentioned before, life is not without risk. But I think it will change greatly when you change the dynamic of thinking to where you put value on life. Because again, we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right, are inalienable rights. Well, you can't have the other ones if you don't have life. And so life is where things have to start. And it has to stem from that. But, coming back to my point, I don't think it's the big government's role to do that. That should be a local community, maybe a local government role in doing that. But these are not, it shouldn't be something at a federal level. And really, when we're talking about that, that's the same thing that happened with Dobbs when they overturned Roe v. Wade, is it went from a national to now back to a state level, just like we talked about in the last podcast. It's about state rights. So now you have communities that can choose to decide whether they want to be pro-life or pro-choice or whatever it is, whether they want to value life or devalue life. And you'll see that come to fruition.
One of the things we talked about last week, and I kind of think this is what led us to talk about abortion this week, is that, but there's a baseline that we say everyone in this country is entitled to X, right? And certain protections. And so the idea that states should be able to decide when I'm allowed to get the standard of practice healthcare. When I show up in an ER, I get different healthcare in California than I do in Georgia. To me, because that's not acceptable, and that's where this is not a states' rights issue. This is an individual. No matter where I live in this country, I should be able to be seen as a whole human with full autonomy over my body. And this is.
So then why shouldn't the baby be seen as a whole human?
Because the baby can't survive.
Like we're going to this, like, Thea, you're coming back around to where saying now your life is more valuable than the baby.
Yes, it is.
It shouldn't be the case. They should have equal value.
I don't think that's true. And that's where we differ. When it was me and I don't want to know that when it was me and I was the one laying in that hospital bed, and this is a memory, not a hypothetical, the idea that someone else could tell me, no, the baby, not you. I wanted that to be my choice. And right now we are in a position where there are women who don't have that choice for themselves, where they can say, I genuinely fear, or this is a choice I want to make for myself. Now the government is dictating that to them. And that to me fundamentally is putting the life of the unborn child and the potential of whatever that unborn child is, or who that unborn child could become a person, versus me, who I am a whole human sitting here living today, and that's, to me, I guess it can be a zero-sum game, and that's the tragedy of that, of the situation.
So as
even in the instance where you're talking about to where you're saying that the doctors would say, no, the baby's more important than you, I think that's wrong too. Right. Again, it's an equal value thing to where you do everything you can to save both. But ultimately, yes, it comes down to where you have a fetus, a human fetus. Keep that in mind, human, right? Talking human rights. Unfortunately, yes, they are still tied to the mother in needs of support. So they are a pursuant, right? So now if the mother's life is at risk, you have to work to save both. But you do the work to save the mother's life. And if the life-giving care you give to the mom results in the death of that child, it's a tragedy, but it's understandable that it happens, right? But to say that the baby is more important than the mom, I think that's a fallacy too. But to say that the mom is important than the baby, that's also wrong.
I'm not saying, I guess from my perspective, the idea that I don't have the ability to say I value my life over that of my unborn child is scary, period, like full stop. But what my bigger argument is that regardless of how I see it, the government should not be the one making that choice for me. And that's and I saw Dion smile a little bit. There goes the little bit of libertarian in me coming out, that I don't think that should be the government's role to make that decision. And that's where we are with these abortion bans.
Yeah, that's where I agree with you, Thea, is I would like to see the government, especially the federal government, get out of the business of dictating death. And I don't know if we're ever going to talk about capital punishment on this podcast, but I'm against that as well. And, I have strong opinions about how we have deployed our troops and dealt death with drones and whatever all around the world. So overall, I would like to see the government just get out of the business of dealing death to people, both its citizens and to people around the world. One of the things that I thought of, Brett, and I don't mean this to like jab you, but you are our resident Republican, and it's kind of one of those things that we were talking about gun rights and the Second Amendment a few episodes ago. And of course, you and I both have very similar opinions about that. And one of the things we brought up is that making something illegal doesn't stop it from happening, right? And so I think one of the things that we also have to consider, and this goes back to your point, Thea, about the way that laws and policies are written today, is we do have to consider the reality on the ground that if we were to outlaw abortion, period, dot, and we were to say as a nation, personhood starts at conception, that's not going to stop people from getting abortions. And then what we end up having is a situation where a woman could have chosen a safe, sterile medical procedure and instead went with the coat hanger, right? With the back alley, putting now her life and her child's life in danger, right? So it's one of those situations where, I personally am not for abortion. I personally would try every other option available to me if I could, if I were part of that calculus. But at the same time, I recognize that life is messy. We live in a society of 350 million odd people who all come from different backgrounds and different situations, and everybody's life situation is different. So I kind of feel like the federal government should back out of this discussion. And like I said before, I would rather see it treated very much like, an end of life decision where the government doesn't really get involved. It's kind of between the family and the doctors to decide what is our best path forward.
So
yeah, and I'm with you on that, Dion, to where I agree. The federal government, this should not be their place. This is why it's pushed back to a states' rights. Again, that's really what the ending of Roe v. Wade did, is it put it back to the states to make those decisions. And you talk about, whether it's outlawed as to whether people will still do it. That's fine, right? No law eliminates a craw 100%, yet we still outlaw things like robbery and domestic abuse. Just the fact that some people might do it illegally is not reason to keep it, right? The legality of action should not depend on whether people might break the law. It should depend on whether the action is right or wrong.
I guess what I'm saying there with the legality of it is, take for instance when we banned alcohol in the United States, people were like, I am going to get alcohol. You can either, and there was all sorts of crime involved in that during Prohibition, right? And then so we could make it so that you can legally buy alcohol, or more currently, you can legally buy weed, or we can keep it criminalized and people are going to do it and go and do criminal acts for weed or whatever. And so the same thing with abortion. If we have the capability to make it safe and legal, so I can't believe these words are about to come out of my mouth, but I actually agree with Bill Clinton when he said this back in 1992. He said abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And I think we have the first two, and we had the first two under Roe v. Wade. It's hard to say that it was rare. The statistics that I came up with were like in 2021, the latest statistics that we had said that the CDC said there were almost 626,000 abortions across the United States. It seems like a lot. And if you look at the research that I put together in the notes, you'll see that a lot of the reasons from surveys that were given as to why women pursued abortions, most of them were not because of health or because of rape or incest or whatever. It was things like not the right time for a baby. That was 36% of respondents, or not financially prepared, 40%. So anyways, if we could get to the point where we have a good social network to where women know that they have options, right? I'm okay with abortion up to a certain point being an option, as long as it's not the only option, right? We as a society should provide many other options. There should be avenues for adoption. There should be avenues for, taking care of that baby, having a way to, if the mother truly feels like she's not financially prepared, maybe we have ways, just like we have, we have welfare, we have, unemployment, we have things like that. Maybe there is something else that we could provide that is a safety net, to your point, Will, to not just be pro-birth, but be pro-life.
Well, yeah, and that, Dion, that gets to your point about if the end goal is less abortions, which I think all of us could agree on, like, if the end goal is just to have less abortions, and 40%, which was number one on that list of reasons why women choose to have an abortion, is financial. To me, that sounds like if you had the right kind of safety net, you could reduce abortions by 40% without taking away the rights of the mother, without having this very controversial thing. You put together the right set of safety nets, you can immediately reduce it by 40%. Like, that's the kind of thing that I do tend to agree with the safe, legal, and rare, right? That if we want it to be rare, there's things we can do short of taking away the women's right to choose.
One thing I want to say before we run out of time, to the point of criminalizing abortion, which is where we are with in some of these states. So I fundamentally disagree that this should be a states' rights issue. I don't think the same. I trust the federal government as much as I trust any state government, including my own, to make this decision for women. But what we're seeing now is, because we've now criminalized this, then when you have something that's a crime, now you run into the situation where women are now are being prosecuted for things that may or may not be abortion. Because I started off this, one of the things I said was there's not a medical distinction between a miscarriage and an abortion, and most people aren't in a hospital when they have a miscarriage. So I dropped in the chat April 5th. There's a story from April 5th of this year of a woman who had a miscarriage in Georgia and was then arrested. And we're seeing more and more of these types of stories across the country, where these miscarriages are happening at home under whatever circumstances. And then when they're presenting for medical care, now the question becomes, was this a botched abortion? And then it becomes a criminal matter instead of a woman seeking healthcare. And, again, that's the thing. It's not just about, maybe I think that at the end of the day, when we criminalize this, it just results in more women being in danger, either being afraid to seek healthcare when they need it, or let's say a woman does take the coat hanger, or which more likely now it's medical abortion, but they don't know what drug they really took because they got it online and it's not safe. But those same women now, are delaying going to seek healthcare because now they're afraid of being prosecuted. It's just, I just don't think that's the society I want to live in.
So I read that article
it's one of those
that you were talking about. I didn't see the specific one that you put in the chat, but I was reading about that before. I think, to be fair, when I was looking at that, I believe the charges that she was charged with had to do with improper disposal of human remains, because she put the baby in a dumpster and somebody found it the day after. So I get what you're saying, that there probably are criminal charges being filed in a lot of these. There are 12 states I saw from my research that have outright banned abortion. So very much I anticipate that there are going to be criminal charges being brought up in those states. I just don't. I want to be factual, and I don't think that situation was one where they charged her under one of these new abortion laws. I think it was the improper disposal of remains.
It's still tied to fetal personhood, because just like I think the one in Ohio where it was in the toilet, again, fetal personhood issues, but it's all under the same umbrella, where I think we're criminalizing the reality of reproduction in human beings, right? And then I think that we're opening the door to pursue, well, what really happened? Did you really have a miscarriage? And that's where, we haven't talked about, one of the conversations we really haven't talked about is like criminal justice in America and how it is not equally enforced. And so I guess for me, that's where my own identity plays in. And typically when there is law enforcement is seeking out people that they believe to be criminal, it's people who look like me, especially women that look like me, or that are most likely to be on the negative receiving end of that. And so it's another reason that I have a problem with outlawing, creating these abortion bans and then criminalizing behavior associated with them.
Well, and that's what we're seeing. Like, even I want to say it was Texas that,
they're even saying, if you leave this state to go get an abortion somewhere else, we're going to charge you with a crime because we say it in Texas, you're not allowed to do it. You shouldn't be able to go to another state and get it done either.
Yeah. Which goes in the face of the Constitution, which gives people the freedom to go from state to state in this country. So that's a whole nother. I question how that can be enforced, and I think when those types of cases, if they are challenged, they will
by tracking people's cycles.
Yeah, but my point is, like, even if you did it, are we going to arrest somebody? Like, let's say gambling is illegal in Florida and someone goes to Vegas, we're going to arrest them because they went and gambled in Vegas. The law, the way our republic is, that you're allowed to freedom of movement between the states. And so that's a whole other debate, but I agree with you. It's another.
So
I think
Thea, as you mentioned, we're getting short on time, and it's about time for us to get into what's been making us happy this week. But I did want to read this quote there was a New York Times article that I came across on the 8th, so just a few days ago from when we are recording this podcast, and it was about this. It was about embryos and personhood and IVF and all that kind of thing. But I found the quote fascinating, and I think our readers or our listeners and viewers will too. It said, "Of the 6 or so people I interviewed for this project, none seemed confident that a good faith society-wide conversation around these questions was possible in America today." And I hope that we have proven to our viewers and listeners that maybe it's possible to have a good faith conversation about this difficult topic and others.
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm walking away from this conversation angry or upset at any of you guys, which is huge because it's a very emotional topic.
Yeah. I certainly appreciate the viewpoints of all of you. I think this has been a great conversation, and I think that our listeners and viewers will hopefully have heard good arguments from all sides, and again, that our disagreements will help inform their decisions in the future. I think I'll get started with what's been making me happy this week, and then we'll go around the horn. And Thea, you'll close us out since you introed us today. All right, so this is going to be really nerdy. I am an engineer after all, but I created this family smartboard thing. Basically, I bought a monitor and a Raspberry Pi and hooked it up to my Google account, and so it brings in our family calendars, and it gives us the weather, and there's a Bible verse of the day, there's a dad joke of the day, and it displays in our kitchen. And I started messing around with it. It's Linux based, so I'm not very up on my Linux, and I messed something up. And so I spent quite a bit of time trying to recover it back to what it was supposed to be. But the entire endeavor of troubleshooting that problem was very fulfilling for me as an engineer. So just trying to figure out, what did I screw up? How did I do it? And how do I fix it and get it back? And I am proud to say that it is back up and running in our kitchen now. My wife can now see the calendar and the weather and everything again.
Nice. All right.
I can jump in.
Go ahead,
jump in, Will. So, Deanna, I actually know we've got one of the skylight calendars that's very similar to that. And, if I had the engineering fortitude that you have to actually go through and do some of the work myself with a Raspberry Pi, I probably would do the same, because there's a lot of features on it that don't match up to what I want. So benefits of customization. But I would say for me this week, what was making me happy, just getting, I can't remember if I said this last week or not, but my daughter started walking, and not just like little baby steps. Did I? Okay. I couldn't remember because this week, she really got into it, where, she's walking all the time, cruising around, so I just been loving that this week. Just joys of parenthood. That's usually where a lot of my happiness comes from. So I guess another one to play along with that is my oldest daughter got to go on her first camping trip this weekend. So she participates in a group called American Heritage Girls. It's very Girl Scout-esque, but they have a lot stronger faith foundation with it. But she got to go on her first camp out. And so she brought home her homemade first aid kit and got to talk about the hiking that she went on and just, all the cool stuff. I mean, she's 7, right? So it's not like it's a, SEAL survival school camp out, but, just some basics. But it's just kind of fun that she's getting into that and enjoying it.
It's cool. All right. So mine, I used to be an avid reader. I mean, not like it was that long ago. I try to read quite a number of books every year. And this year I've been way far behind, mostly just because of the campaign that I'm running and having to go to so many events and everything. And when I come home, I just want to kind of crash out. And previously, I would also read just a whole lot of nonfiction, political, current event type books. But probably in the last week or so, I have finally kind of started picking back up reading again. And I can't handle the nonfiction. My brain is too fried. So it's just been nonstop. I don't want to say like trash books, but like purely fiction. The one I'm reading right now, I don't even know the name of it, but like half the world dies, and then a video game dungeon gets created, and everyone has to travel around this video game dungeon to survive. And it is kind of like just pure trash. Like,
I mean, as long as it's not focusing on like, throbbing or undulating, I think you'll be okay, Will.
No, it's not. Definitely not. Well, I have read some of those because of my wife, like all those dragon books and the fairies and what are they, fae,
Yeah.
I've read the
Will is a grown-ass adult, and if he wants to read that kind of stuff, that's his prerogative.
I've read Fourth Wing. I've read all that stuff. But yeah, just getting back into reading. And like, I do enjoy it. It really just kind of calms me down a little bit and lets my brain have a break from the day. So that's been making me happy.
Okay. So mine is, I'm a Laker fan. I'm a huge Laker fan. I think I might have said that on the show before. But there is a documentary on HBO Max called Celtic City right now. And it's about the history of the Boston Celtics. And so at first I was like, I don't watch this because the only team that's won more championships than my Lakers is the Celtics by one, but by one championship. And obviously the 80s like defined, the Lakers Celtics rivalry defined the 80s. So anyway, I was like, let me watch this, so I watched it, and then I went down to Palm Springs and I'm talking to my dad about it. And the thing that's actually making me happy is it reminded me of how I got into basketball. So my dad, I'm one of 3 girls. So when I was a kid, my dad would always watch sports, and basketball was one of the sports that he would watch that I liked watching with him. And so like as a kid in the 80s, I would watch the Lakers with him and cheer on Magic Johnson. And like, that's some of my earliest memories that I have with my dad. And so getting to like reminisce about that with him this week was like really, I was like, oh, wow, I'm grateful that we have this thing, and as I get older, I have a different appreciation for my parents. So I know a lot of times we talk about all the things that we have with our kids, but I know my parents aren't going to be here forever. And so it was really nice that this like documentary about a team that I hate, but why do I hate them? Because me and my dad used to watch and cheer against the Celtics, when I was a kid. And so that made me happy. Just those conversations and us laughing about Larry Bird being a jerk and, all that kind of stuff. Great basketball player, not a nice guy on the court, and so it was fun. So if you want to check out that, it's like, I think they're on episode 5, maybe 6, and it's not done yet. They've just now hit the end of the 80s. So it's been pretty interesting. If you're a sports fan, I'd recommend it.
Thea, are you watching that basketball show? I think it's got Kate Hudson in it.
It's on my list. Yeah, where she's basically like owns the team.
Yeah, she becomes the GM.
Yeah, I want to watch it. I heard good things about it though, that it's funny.
Yeah, my wife and I have watched a couple of episodes so far, and I would keep watching it I don't know if my wife will, but
okay. All right. Well, I guess that wraps us up. Hopefully you guys our audience enjoyed the conversation. We don't know what we're going to talk about next week, but it sounds like we have a couple of options out there with death penalty and perhaps criminal justice. I don't know. We'll figure something out. But thanks for listening, and like and subscribe if you haven't already, wherever you get your podcasts. All right.
Bye, everyone.